7 northern white rhinos. That is the entire population of a subspecies that once roamed hundreds of miles across Central Africa. Not hundreds of animals, not dozens, 7. However, the scientists who gathered around that number did not accept it as a death sentence. They made a decision so technically audacious, so biologically unprecedented, that it rewrote what conservation even means. Frozen sperm, harvested eggs, surrogate mothers of a different subspecies. This may be the most extraordinary wildlife rescue ever attempted. Nobody was paying attention to northern white rhinos back then. They were not the headline animal, not the flagship species filling donor brochures. That was about to change. At their peak in the early 70s, several hundred northern white rhinos moved across a vast stretch of Central Africa, spanning what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Sudan, and Chad. They were not a marginal population clinging to a shrinking corner of the continent. They were a thriving subspecies, deeply embedded in the ecosystems they shaped. Garamba National Park in the DRC became their last major stronghold, eventually recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site specifically because of the rhinos it sheltered. But even then, the northern white rhino was not simply a tourist attraction, it was a keystone grazer. These animals moved through open savanna grasslands in patterns that maintained vegetation structure, creating habitat conditions that supported entire communities of other species. Remove the rhino, and you do not just lose the rhino, you lose the landscape it built. What also made this subspecies distinct was its biology. The northern white rhino was not simply a geographic variant of its southern cousin. It carried a different skull shape, a different diet preference, and a different relationship with its habitat. Scientists classified it as a genuinely separate evolutionary line, one that had diverged over millennia into something irreplaceable. And then the northern white rhino made the one decision that changed everything. It kept existing in a part of the world where existing was about to become extraordinarily dangerous. By the late 1970s, the first alarm bells were ringing. Anti-poaching operations launched across the range states. International conservation funding began flowing into Garamba. The global community had noticed, and it was trying to act. Poaching pressure had been building for years. The demand for rhino horn in parts of Asia and the Middle East was creating economic incentives so powerful that local enforcement simply could not compete. A single horn could fetch more than a year's wages for a local worker. That math was brutally simple. The rangers on the ground saw it coming. They filed reports, flagged the escalating threat, and asked for more resources. Nobody listened with nearly enough urgency. Picture a fortress slowly losing its walls. That is what happened to Garamba National Park across the 1980s and 1990s. Not a single catastrophic collapse, but a grinding, relentless erosion of everything that was supposed to protect the northern white rhino. And by the time the world fully understood what was happening, the damage was almost total. The mechanism was straightforward, and that almost makes it worse. Rhino horn, composed of keratin, the same protein found in human fingernails, had been assigned extraordinary value in traditional medicine markets across parts of Asia, particularly Vietnam and China, where it was believed to treat fever, cancer, and a range of other conditions. None of those claims had scientific support, but belief does not require evidence to drive a market. In the Middle East, horn was carved into ceremonial dagger handles, a status symbol with deep cultural roots in Yemen specifically. The result was a black market so lucrative that organized criminal networks, not just opportunistic local poachers, began moving into the trade with military-grade coordination. In the DRC, the political situation handed those networks an extraordinary opening. The country had been destabilized by decades of conflict, corruption, and institutional collapse. By the 1990s, Garamba was not simply a national park struggling with poaching. It was operating inside an active conflict zone. Armed militias moved through the park. Rangers were outgunned, outmanned, and in some cases simply absent because it was too dangerous to patrol. Aerial surveys, which had been the primary tool for monitoring rhino populations, became impossible or wildly unreliable when the airspace above the park was contested. Ground surveys were even more dangerous. Field teams reported that moving through Garamba meant encountering armed groups who had no interest in conservation and every interest in the ivory and horn those animals represented. The numbers tell a story that is almost impossible to absorb slowly. In the early 1980s, estimates placed the wild northern white rhino population at somewhere between 500 and 700 animals. By the late 1980s, that number had collapsed to below 30. Through the 1990s, the decline continued, and by the early 2000s, confirmed sightings in the wild had become so rare that field researchers were beginning to question whether any animals remained at all. Surveys in 2005 and 2006 returned almost nothing. Camera traps produced no images. Track evidence was absent. The animals had effectively vanished from the landscape. In 2008, the International Union for Conservation of Nature made the call that conservation organizations dread making. Wild northern white rhinos were functionally extinct. The subspecies that had shaped Central African savannas for millennia, the keystone grazer that had supported entire ecological communities, had been poached out of existence in the wild within a single human lifetime, not over centuries, within decades. The speed of it is staggering. What made the collapse so devastating was not just the loss of the animals themselves, but what it revealed about the limits of conventional conservation. Protected area status had not saved Garamba. International funding had not saved Garamba. Anti-poaching operations had not saved Garamba. Every tool in the standard conservation toolkit had been deployed, and every one of them had been overwhelmed by a combination of economic incentive, political instability, and organized criminal infrastructure that simply outpaced the response. The northern white rhino did not disappear because nobody cared. It disappeared because caring was not enough. There is a specific kind of desperation that settles over a conservation program when the wild population disappears and the only animals left are the ones in zoos. It is not hopelessness exactly. It is something more like standing in a burning building and realizing the only exit leads to a very small ledge. Dvor Králové Zoo in the Czech Republic had been the primary captive breeding center for northern white rhinos since the 1970s. The zoo had genuine success in those early decades, achieving several births that kept the captive population alive, and conservationists reason to believe that a managed breeding program could eventually stabilize the subspecies. But by the 2000s, reproduction had stalled. The animals were aging, the genetic pool was narrow, and the births simply stopped coming. In 2009, 4 northern white rhinos remained at Dvor Králové, Sudan, an adult male who had been captured as a calf in Sudan in 1975 and brought to the zoo, making him the last male of his subspecies on Earth. Suni, the second male, also aging. Najin, a female and Sudan's daughter. And Fatou, Najin's daughter and Sudan's granddaughter. 4 animals, 2 generations. The entire future of a subspecies compressed into a single extended family. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense, at least not on the surface. The decision was made to move all 4 animals from a European zoo to a wildlife conservancy in Kenya. The logic, debated intensely at the time, was that northern white rhinos had evolved in Africa. Their hormonal cycles, their social behaviors, the reproductive triggers were shaped by African light patterns, temperatures, and vegetation. The artificial environment of a Czech zoo, however well managed, might simply be suppressing the biological signals that would normally prompt breeding. Olpejeta Conservancy in central Kenya was chosen as the destination. Olpejeta had originally been a cattle ranch, one of the largest in East Africa, before being converted into a high-security wildlife sanctuary. By the time the rhinos arrived, the conservancy had built a formidable infrastructure around them. Armed rangers patrolled around the clock. The perimeter was fenced and monitored. The 4 animals received individual veterinary attention and were given access to large naturalistic enclosures designed to approximate the habitat conditions of their ancestral range. In December 2009, all 4 northern white rhinos were loaded onto a specially configured aircraft and flown from the Czech Republic to Kenya. It was an extraordinary logistical operation, coordinated across multiple governments, conservation organizations, and veterinary teams. The world watched with cautious hope, and then the years passed. The African climate did not restart the reproductive biology the way everyone had hoped. Sudan aged. His sperm count dropped to levels that made natural conception effectively impossible. Najin developed leg problems that made it unsafe for her to bear the weight of a mounting male. Fatou was found to have uterine abnormalities that prevented her from carrying a pregnancy to term. Natural breeding window, already narrow, closed entirely. If the program had stopped here, this would be a very different story, but the scientists at Olpejeta and their international partners were not ready to stop. The morning of October 17th, 2014 started like any other at Olpejeta, and then the rangers found Suni. He had died overnight quietly, without apparent distress from natural causes. He was 34 years old. In a single morning, the world had lost one of only 2 remaining northern white rhino males. The breeding options, already almost non-existent, had just been cut in half. half. Now, the scientists could have stopped there. They didn't. Sudan, the last male, became the most guarded animal on Earth. He was assigned a 24-hour armed security detail. Not symbolic protection, but a genuine military-style operation, because his horn alone would have made him a target worth killing for. Veterinary teams monitored his health daily. He became, improbably, a global celebrity. In 2017, his profile was listed on the dating app Tinder in a fundraising campaign that generated international headlines and raised significant awareness. The world knew his name, but Sudan was old. Born in the wild around 1973, he had spent more than 4 decades in captivity. By 2017, he was visibly declining. Arthritis had spread through his legs, making movement painful. Skin lesions developed. His appetite dropped. The veterinary team at Ol Pejeta made every effort to keep him comfortable, but the trajectory was clear. On March 19, 2018, Sudan was euthanized. The decision was made by his veterinary team after it became clear that his suffering had reached a point where continued life could not be justified. He was approximately 45 years old, ancient for a rhino. The announcement went around the world within hours. News organizations that rarely covered wildlife ran front-page stories. People who had never heard of the northern white rhino before grieved publicly on social media. And no, I'm not making that up. A single animal's death generated a global moment of mourning that most endangered species never receive in their entire history. What remained was this: 2 females, Najin, Sudan's daughter, approximately 30 years old, with leg problems severe enough that a pregnancy would put dangerous physical stress on her joints. Fatu, Najin's daughter and Sudan's granddaughter, with uterine abnormalities confirmed by multiple veterinary examinations, meaning she could produce eggs, but could not carry a calf to term. Neither animal could naturally reproduce. The subspecies had no males. Natural conception was not just unlikely, it was biologically impossible. The northern white rhino had a narrow window before functional extinction became total extinction, and the clock had already started. Inside a veterinary tent at Ol Pejeta Conservancy on August 22, 2019, a team of scientists performed a procedure that had never been attempted on a northern white rhino before. Under full general anesthesia, with ultrasound guidance and specialized equipment, they extracted oocytes, unfertilized eggs, from Fatu. The eggs were placed in a temperature-controlled transport container and flown to a laboratory in Cremona, Italy. Within hours of collection, there they were fertilized using frozen sperm that had been collected from Sudan and from Sunni before their deaths, stored in liquid nitrogen at negative 196 degrees Celsius, preserved specifically for this moment. Biorescue Consortium had spent years building toward that day. Formed under the coordination of the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research in Berlin, Germany, Biorescue brought together scientists from Germany, Italy, Kenya, and the Czech Republic, along with tens of millions of dollars in funding from governments, foundations, and private donors. The program was not a single laboratory side project. It was a coordinated international scientific effort with one specific goal: create viable northern white rhino embryos and eventually implant them into surrogate mothers. The mechanism required solving several problems simultaneously. Harvesting eggs from a 2-ton rhinoceros under field conditions in Kenya without damaging them was itself a major veterinary challenge. Transporting biological material across international borders, strict temperature controls required diplomatic coordination and customs exemptions. Fertilizing the eggs in a laboratory using decades-old frozen sperm that had been collected under circumstances nobody had fully optimized for long-term storage, required precise technique and a significant degree of scientific luck. The result, announced in late 2019, was historic. The team had successfully created the first viable northern white rhino embryos in history. 2 embryos, confirmed viable, frozen, and stored. Proof that the concept worked. Proof that the genetic material of a functionally extinct subspecies could be combined in a laboratory and produce something capable of becoming a living animal. The implications were staggering. For the first time since Sudan's death, there was a genuine biological pathway back from the edge. Not a guaranteed one, not a simple one, but a real one. There is something almost surreal about standing in front of a liquid nitrogen storage tank and knowing that what is inside represents the entire future of a subspecies. The tank is small. The temperature temperature inside is colder than the surface of Pluto, and the timing of what happened next, almost too perfect. Between 2020 and 2024, the biorescue team conducted repeated egg collection cycles from both Najin and Fatu. Each procedure was a major veterinary operation. The animals had to be anesthetized, which carries risk for any large mammal. The collection equipment had to be precisely positioned using ultrasound guidance. The extracted oocytes had to be assessed for quality and viability before transport. Every cycle was a high-stakes medical event, not a routine procedure. The cumulative result was extraordinary. By 2024, the program had created and frozen more than 30 northern white rhino embryos, stored in liquid nitrogen at -196 degrees Celsius. Each embryo represents a unique genetic combination drawn from the limited but still distinct genetic material available from Najin, Fatu, Sudan, and Sunni. Genetic diversity within that collection is limited by the small number of source animals, but each unique combination matters enormously for any future population's ability to resist disease and adapt to environmental change. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. The regulatory frameworks governing the creation of embryos from functionally extinct subspecies, their international transport, their potential implantation into surrogate animals of a different subspecies span multiple countries and multiple legal systems, none of which had rules specifically written for this situation. Parallel to the embryo program, biorescue scientists began working on something even more ambitious. Skin samples collected from long-dead northern white rhinos, some of them stored in biobanks for decades, were used to grow induced pluripotent stem cells, iPSCs. These are adult cells that have been genetically reprogrammed to behave like embryonic stem cells, capable of differentiating into any cell type, including, theoretically, sperm and eggs. If that technology can be perfected, it would allow scientists to generate entirely new genetic lines from animals that have been dead for decades, dramatically expanding the genetic diversity available for rebuilding a population. The cost of all of this is not small. Security operations at Olpejeta alone run into the millions of dollars annually. Total investment in the biorescue program across all partner institutions runs into the tens of millions. The frozen embryo library in that liquid nitrogen tank would come back to haunt every budget projection the consortium ever made. That's getting ahead of the story. Southern white rhinos are the closest living relatives of the northern white rhino, sharing approximately 99.7% of their genetic sequence. But they are a distinct subspecies with their own reproductive biology, their own gestation timeline of approximately 16 months, and their own hormonal rhythms that govern when and how pregnancy can occur. Using one as a surrogate for the other is not a straightforward transplant. It is an inter-subspecies reproductive experiment with no precedent in the scientific literature. The surrogate candidates at Olpejeta must pass through months of preparation before an embryo transfer can even be attempted. The real question isn't whether science can save the northern white rhino, it's whether we're willing to do this for every species we push to the edge.